A man in a hot air balloon realized that he was lost. He reduced his altitude, he spotted a woman below, and he descended a bit more, and he shouted to her, "Excuse me, can you help me? I promised a friend I would meet him an hour ago, but I don't know where I am." Well, the woman replied, "You're in a hot air balloon hovering around 30 feet above the ground. You're between 40 and 45 degrees north latitude and between 59 and 60 degrees west longitude." "You must be in information technology," said the balloonist. "Well, I am," replied the woman. "How did you know?" "Well, everything you told me is technically correct, but I've no idea what to make of your information, and the fact is I'm still lost. Frankly, you've not been much help at all. If anything, you've delayed my trip." Well, the woman below responded, "You must be in leadership of an organization." I am," replied the balloonist. But how did you know?" "Well," said the woman, "you didn't know where you are or where you're going. You have risen to where you are due to a large quantity of hot air. You made a promise which you've no idea how to keep, and you expect people beneath you to solve your problems. The fact is, you are in exactly the same position you were in before we met, but now somehow it's my fault." Now, there's a character in the New Testament who I increasingly regard as a kind of passive mentor in the area of Christian leadership. Now, the name his parents gave him was Joseph, but most people recognize him by a nickname that leaders of the early church gave him, that they called him Barnabas, which literally meant son of encouragement. And to call someone the son of something in Jewish culture was a way of describing their character, as if they were a particular offspring or outcome of a certain behavior. Barnabas, or son of encouragement, was a way of describing someone encouraging to be around. It was a huge compliment. People thought well of you. They looked forward to spending time with you. So what was it about this character Barnabas that was so different? I mean, we live today in an age of advanced scientific knowledge and genetic engineering. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could somehow identify the Barnabas gene and then have ourselves genetically modified in order to behave the same way? And why did people speak and think so warmly of Barnabas? A number of aspects of his character are illustrated for us throughout the New Testament. For instance, as a leader, Barnabas had a kind of sixth sense when it came to recognizing people's value. He seemed to be able to see what others couldn't see, or perhaps refused to see because of their prejudice. In Acts chapter 9, it tells the account of Saul's dramatic conversion. As we know, Saul had a particular hatred for followers of Jesus. He'd had believers arrested and tried and sentenced to death, and there was huge fear amongst the early Christians about what Saul might do to them. But then the most amazing thing happened. En route to Damascus, Saul had this personal encounter with God. Blinded with a bright light, Saul, the persecutor, became a follower of Jesus, one of those he was hunting down. Well, it's not hard to imagine how the early Christians would have been a little bit suspicious about the validity of Saul's conversion. I mean, was it genuine? Or was this a ploy to get access to the inside of the church? I mean, imagine how we might respond if someone who was mercilessly persecuting us suddenly wanted to join our community. I mean, how would you respond to a nasty neighbour who's taking you to court over a property boundary dispute and then all of a sudden sends you a dinner invitation? You'd be really cautious about that. Well, that's exactly what happened to Saul. And in Acts chapter 9, verse 26, we read this: "When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple." But there was one person in the Jerusalem church who saw beyond fear and skepticism. Verse 27 says, "But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. he told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. And so Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Barnabas was one of those characters who doesn't merely conform to the values or the prejudices of the crowd. He saw in Saul the grace of God at work. We might want to say that Barnabas had a view of God that was big enough to believe that God could save or turn around the vilest of sinners, and he was willing to give Saul a second chance. And because of Barnabas, Saul became accepted in the church. He helped Saul get across the doorstep of the church for the first time, and he took the risk of giving him a go when others only wanted to write him off. But then there's another incident where Barnabas saw the potential in a person whom others were rejecting. In Acts 15, Barnabas and Saul, or Paul as he was later known, of course, were a formidable ministry team. They travelled internationally preaching the gospel and planting churches. However, they experienced a serious dispute. It says this in verse 36 of Acts chapter 15. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Well, John Mark's actually an interesting character. We know that he and Barnabas were actually cousins. It says that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. It's generally regarded that Mark was a young man during the ministry of Jesus and later on authored the second gospel of the New Testament. However, he also made a very serious mistake. He'd been a part of Paul and Barnabas' ministry team some years earlier, but he'd run out on them when the going got tough. And as far as Paul was concerned, well, Mark had to be dropped from the team. He was no longer credible as a servant of the Lord. He couldn't be trusted. But Barnabas seemed to see something in Mark that Paul couldn't. Yes, he'd failed. He'd really let them down, and no doubt Paul had some justification at being angry at him. However, Barnabas also saw potential for good. Barnabas saw beyond failure or mistakes to future restoration. Barnabas was willing to give him another chance. Well, the conflict between Paul and Barnabas was so severe over this, they ended up parting company. And it begs the question, who had the right perspective? I think we know the answer. In the end, you'd actually have to say it was Barnabas, not Paul. At some point further on in Paul's ministry, he must have come to that conclusion himself because, well, Mark appears again in Paul's letters as one of his trusted companions. Paul describes him as a faithful servant of the Lord. In other words, Barnabas gave a failure a second chance, and Mark went on to be a powerful servant of the Lord. In Acts chapter 11, there's another interesting development in the life of the church. Up until this point, the growth and spread of Christianity had basically been amongst Jewish people. However, in Acts chapter 11, the gospel jumped the ethnic fence and a bunch of Gentiles became Christians. Now, for the leaders of the early church, this was actually all a bit of a concern. Would these non-Jews do things correctly? Without their Jewish background knowledge of God's dealing with his chosen race over thousands of years, would their theology be orthodox? Was this truly something God was doing, or was this actually a distraction from the right path? So the leaders of the church sent one of their number to check it out. They sent Barnabas. Acts 11 verse 22. News of this reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. And when he arrived and saw the evidence of the grace of God, he was glad. He encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. It's interesting to note who they selected to check out these new Christians in Antioch. That they sent someone who was deeply steeped in Jewish thinking. The first mention of Barnabas in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 4, verse 36, which, among other things, tells us that he was a Levite. And the Levites, they were the priestly class within Judaism. They were the thoroughly immersed and trained in the ways of the law. That they were the Jews of the Jews. And here we read of a Levite going to check out a bunch of non-Jews who were becoming followers of the Messiah. Think about this. Barnabas would have had to step over generations of ingrained thinking and racial prejudice. What was happening in Antioch was very different to how Barnabas had been taught or brought up. But the text says that when he got there and saw the evidence of the grace of God, he was glad and he encouraged them. Now, let's stop and think about this. Barnabas, it would seem, had this open mind for something new that God was doing. Jewish boys and girls have been brought up believing that the only reason God created the Gentile races was basically to provide fuel for the fires of hell. But here were Gentiles worshipping and following the same Messiah as the Christians in Jerusalem. Barnabas' mind was open to see and to accept something new that God was doing. Well, can I be so bold as to suggest that such is the mind and the adaptability of a successful Christian leader in the 21st century? We live on the edge of cataclysmic change, and churches and ministries and mission organizations that will survive and prosper in the next few decades, that they will need to recognize the grace of God at work in very different ways to how many of us grew up. Isn't it true that we get ourselves wedded to our past patterns of doing things without really knowing or thinking about it? I love the story of the woman who always cut the two ends off a piece of beef roast before she put it in her oven. And one day her husband asked her why she did this, and she replied, well, actually, I don't know why I do that, but my mother always did, so I have. Well, the next time that they were at her mother's place, they asked her why she did it, and she gave him a similar reply. The next week they were visiting her grandmother, and they asked the same question. The grandmother replied, well, that's easy. When I buy a piece of beef, it's usually this big, but it won't fit into my roasting dish, which is this big. So I cut the two ends off the roast in order to make it fit. According to the Bible, that the God of the Christians is perpetually doing a new thing. Pastors and Christian leaders with the Barnabas gene have an open mind, and they can recognize what God is doing. They see the grace of God at work in the lives of people, and they bless it and they encourage it. In 1 Chronicles chapter 12, there's an interesting list of fighting men from each of the tribes of Israel who were willing to stand with David against the army of King Saul. And amidst that long list, there's a fascinating little statement about the men of one tribe in particular. Verse 32, men of Issachar, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. 200 chiefs with all their relatives under their command. If you ever want to know how to pray for Christian leaders in this day and age, pray that they will be like the men of Issachar, who understand the times that we're living in and know what the household of faith should do. Pray that they will have courage and wisdom to see beyond the blueprints of the past, and the temerity to lead new expressions of faith and mission that will touch the people of a new millennium. And to those of us whom God has called to offer leadership in His mission, learn to look beyond the obvious. See beyond presenting issues that people display to the potential that's awaiting to be unleashed. I'm almost certain there are people who have done this for us in our past. They look beyond our mistakes, our imperfections. They encourage us to keep going. Every now and then, when I want to have a bit of a laugh, I read through some of my early sermons when I started out as a pastor 42 years ago. Oh my goodness. But now it's our turn to be like Barnabas for others. May God bless us as we see the new things that God is doing and are glad in our hearts, and we encourage them to follow the Lord.